We have 12 Civil War Times and some other Look and Life magazine Civil War related stuff from the 1960s. Is a whole group, that's one other bid. And then we have the 4-volume set of R.E. Lee, Freeman's R.E. Lee. That's a bid. So you can bid tonight. I'll stick around afterwards, write it down on the clipboard. I will tally that up during the month and post it, but then we also have an email address that if you want to bid during the month, you can also bid. So once I say who's leading the pack, if you will, then you can feel free to bid during the month. We will cut off all the bids at 7 o'clock next month, so I don't want to be doing this while the speaker's speaking. So we're cutting it off at 7 next month, and then after the meeting, if you're the winning bidder, you pick up what you pay, and then pick up your stuff. Okay? So spread the word, help us out. Appreciate it.
And it's all in the newsletter.
It's all in the newsletter.
And the website.
The museum dedicated where a microphone, if that's okay. With all you got turned on, you just kind of put this guy in your pocket. And then just attach this to your shirt.
Can you do it?
I can. I really appreciate you being here too, sir.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
We'll get you squared away with your speakers.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. My name is Matt Borders. I'm the president of the Roundtable, and tonight's speaker is Leon Reed. He's coming to us down from Gettysburg, but we're not actually talking about a Gettysburg topic tonight. We're going to be talking about the war itself, what brings on the war, and these critical months right after, is it months or month?
Month.
Month after Fort Sumter. But before we do that, as is tradition, we're going to hit our raffle. And we generally have our speaker pull the first ticket. So,
Great.
Mr. Reed, if you wouldn't mind. Oh, I think you're holding down.
Oh, well, and that concludes my presentation.
So, our first numbers tonight, 842. Excellent. We got our first one. How many items tonight? 5. Excellent. All right, so that's our first one. 848. All right, 2 down. 826. 826. All right, very good. 3 draws, 3 successes so far. 819. All right. And we've got one more for tonight. 828. You got another one?
Yeah.
You're welcome to it if you wish it.
No.
All right. That was very generous of you, so I appreciate that. 832. Different number. There we go. Excellent. All right. So again, thank you everyone for supporting the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable with the raffle. We greatly appreciate it. Definitely check out the items that Ken has put up for the bigger auction. That's something new we're trying, and we greatly appreciate all the efforts that he's been putting into that. Couple of headlines. I imagine most of us in the Civil War and preservation community have heard about this, but there is another big preservation threat coming into wilderness battlefields, so keep an eye on that. There's going to be some community discussions. I believe the American Battlefield Trust is advancing another campaign to try to do something about this threat, but it looks like just off the park grounds there, they're going to be trying to put in some development with maybe even a road that will be passing through part of the NPS property. We don't know how that's going to fare. Obviously, Park Service is going to have its own issues to bring up, but definitely something to keep an eye on. As we're moving into the summer, also keep in mind that we have a lot of battlefields around this area. The programs are going to be starting up very, very soon. And even right here in downtown Frederick, there's actually going to be, starting in June, a couple of Civil War exhibits at the Seaver Arts Library. Okay? And we'll get you some more details about those as well. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Reed. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, sir. And let's have a great program. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming out. I call this presentation and the book, which will be written within a month or so, Fort Sumter and its Long Shadow. And I leave out one step. The intermediate step is Lincoln's speech calling for 75,000 volunteers. Probably the more accurate title would be Lincoln's speech and its long shadow, but I like Fort Sumter. Two things happened as a result of Lincoln's speech. The first thing is, amazingly, the North created an army of 75,000 volunteers, almost overnight. We never talk about that. We talk about what a botch the first time they used them in a battle was. But the fact that such an army came into being is, I learned, nothing short of amazing. So I'm going to talk about that. The second thing that happened was, of course, immediately following Lincoln's election, the 7 Deep South states, basically the states along the coast from South Carolina to Texas, seceded. But there are 8 other states that still had slavery who for now remained in the Union. Of those 8, Delaware really never was in play. It barely was a slave state at the time. The other 7 states, including Maryland, had another round of, rethinking their commitment to the Union. Spoiler alert, I believe that set of 7 decisions by those 7 states, based on the research I've done, collectively the most important decision, certainly of the secession era, possibly of the entire Civil War. I believe, the fate of the Civil War rested on the decisions of those 7 states. I hope I make that case. And with no more, I'll jump into it. This project got its start. I had a cousin, also a Reed. We went to high school together. We were pretty good friends in high school. Obviously, we sat next to each other at graduation. At the end of graduation, we shook hands. We said, "Well done, Reed. Have a good summer." And we had we bumped into each other briefly at the 10th reunion. Otherwise, no further contact for about 40 years. It will surprise you not that the instrument of our getting back in touch was Facebook. We have now kind of become sort of the brothers each of us never had. I mean, our wives think it's hysterical. We make a phone call to each other once a month, and we've been known to talk for as much as 3 hours. But early on in the process of getting reacquainted, he says to me, "You're really interested in the Civil War. Would you be interested in seeing a scrapbook I have? An ancestor of mine put it together in 1861. He was an official of something called the New York Military Association. It's pretty cool. It's got a letter from Robert Anderson, a letter from Horace, and I sort of fainted dead away. And when I recovered, I said, yeah, I really would like to see that. He mailed the thing to me. I wanted to mail myself back to Columbus and slap him for it. But that's the cover of it, Union Souvenirs. He was definitely a Union guy. Fascinating document. He was the corresponding secretary, so he's the guy who wrote the correspondence, obviously. I'll tell you more what the New York Military Association is as we proceed. He wrote and received correspondence. Some of it he kind of kept, and it's in there. newspaper articles, little vignettes, handwritten things with photos and stuff of key event, like there's one on Fort Sumter, there's one on Elmer Ellsworth, various events early on. This collection is 1861, 1862. Something I wasn't aware was a thing. Over 300 mint condition patriotic envelopes. These are sort of the internet memes of the Civil War. They're little envelopes that could be used to mail letters. Plenty of them were. Plenty of them were also saved as souvenirs. But they had a drawing and a witty little saying on them. Sometimes it was just the Constitution and the laws forever, our great glorious country. Sometimes, picture of Independence Hall, picture of George Washington, not Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis with a rope around his neck. This is what happens to traitors. Celebrating the latest martyr, which of course was the early, Elmer Ellsworth, people like that, celebrating our glorious victories. George McClellan, the liberator of Western Virginia, things like this. It occurred to me as I'm paging through them, they make a nice illustrated set for an illustrated history of the secession crisis, because they cover everything. And they give you insights. I mean, these were printed by private printers. They printed them to make money. If you find 6 envelopes on a given topic, you can be pretty confident the first 5 sold, because nobody's printing a 6th one if the first didn't sell. So there was no polling. It gives you some insights into what was on the public's mind. That's one, New York Volunteer Militia, that's an example. That insight led to a book that I wrote about 3 years ago, heavily illustrated with patriotic covers, kind of an overview of the secession crisis. It covers a lot of topics I'm not going to address tonight. It proceeds from basically Lincoln's election really until the early spring battles of 1862. Tonight I'm just talking about the things that are bold underlined. Really, not even to Bull Run. So, as I said, the 2 issues I referred to at the beginning, as I worked more and more, it just jumped out at me how, to me, fascinating and important those 2 issues were. So for the last couple of years, I've been working on a book focusing strictly on those 2 things. I've got it with me and I'm doing a final proof job on it. So it'll be out in print this summer. Quick review, probably most of you know this, 1860 election, most consequential in history. Second highest turnout ever. You'll be surprised to know the Hayes-Tilden in 1876 was the highest percentage turnout. The Democratic Party, of course, shattered. Factions of the party nominated 3 different candidates. The regulars nominated Senator Stephen Douglas. The militant Southerners nominated the sitting Vice President John Breckinridge. And the Unionist Southerners nominated retiring Senator John Bell. This initiated the longest presidential losing streak ever. They lost that election and the next 5. And 11 of the 13 between James Buchanan and Woodrow Wilson. Grover Cleveland was the only Democrat elected president. It's a long string of Republican presidents. He was elected, of course, twice. In essence, the election was really 2 different elections, one in the north between Lincoln and Douglas, one in the south between Breckinridge and Bell, with in the middle states, Douglas slightly a factor, but basically the border states, Maryland, et cetera, pretty much were Bell against Breckinridge. And by the way, Lincoln did not win because he had 3 opponents and divided the vote. If you had taken every vote cast for anybody other than Lincoln and given them to one candidate, Lincoln, with 40% of the popular vote, still would have won the electoral vote because he piled up massive victories in the northern states. He was still carried those states. All that would have happened was Douglas or Breckinridge, whichever was the runner-up, would have carried a few states that he didn't. First round, as I said, 7 states went out quickly. Reminder, the new president at this time was not inaugurated till March. The lame duck period lasted 6 weeks longer than it does now. The lame duck period seems interminable to me now. Imagine 6 more weeks of it. South Carolina was gone within a month. Her senators resigned the day after the election. John Crittenden from Kentucky made, well, a lot of people, but Crittenden was the most serious, made an effort to forge a compromise. It wasn't much of a compromise. It was called, it really was, what concessions can we make to keep the South from going out? And basically what it framed was everything that has been on the table for discussion in the past compromises. Slave trade in D.C., permanent 3/5 compromise, recovery of fugitive slaves. Let's make them constitutional amendments this time instead of laws. It was basically what the Crittenden Compromise was. Lincoln said to his people, go ahead, participate in the discussion, but I do not authorize you to vote for any compromise that allows any slaves to be brought into any new territory. Well, that's the end of the discussions, because that's, you know, the Southerners thought they were making a huge concession by restoring the Missouri Compromise line and saying slavery below and none above, saying no slavery. Lincoln said repeatedly, I'm not going to interfere with slavery where it exists, but I don't think it should spread. Anybody who was literate knew that's the death knell for slavery. It's just the slow death knell for slavery, because as more and, you know, we're already outnumbered, you know, something like 20 to 15. As we admit another 20 states, and there, I mean, we become an insignificant faction, we the slave states. And eventually the time comes the free states can pass an amendment. We're out of business. So everybody knew that when Lincoln says, I'm not an abolitionist, I'm just against the spread of slavery, he's saying abolish slavery over a period of time. The North actually responded quite calmly to the first round of secession, the 7 states going out. There was, some people said, go in peace. The abolitionists tend to say good riddance. Most kind of said, you know, we have these dust-ups every 5 or 10 years. It's always harder than it was the previous time. We always figure something out. We'll figure something out. There was particularly in New York City, and since a good bit of my presentation is about the captains of Wall Street were very sympathetic to the South. Of course, they're totally, I mean, Wall Street, you know, the U.S. economy is cotton. It's all, essentially all our exports. Our biggest manufacturing is making products out of Southern cotton. You know, the biggest clients for the banks are Southern plantations and manufacturers. So Wall Street is totally ingrained with the Southern economy. There was a stock market crash when the secession started. They were very sympathetic. They wrote a long letter to the South saying, please be patient while we sort this. We can come up with something, allow us to come up with something to sort this out. However, the sympathy of those people came right, it ended with secession. If you guys are going to leave, then you're not our friends anymore. We talk about unionists because in the middle states, until April 15th, they were all unionists, really. It's important to understand what unionists are. Unionists were not people who loved the North. Unionists were not people who were against slavery. The difference between a unionist and a fire eater had little to do with policy, most to do with tactics. Fire eaters said, it's hopeless, the only way we can get our rights is to tear the house down. Unionists said, the most effective way to get our rights is to work within the system and demand our rights. And if they had some practical points. Once you leave the Union, you may not like the way the Fugitive Slave Act is enforced. Once you leave the Union, there's no more Fugitive Slave Act. They make it to Pennsylvania, and you come to Pennsylvania, they're going to say, where's your passport? Generally, Unionists agreed on all the important recovery of slaves, right to take property into territories. Even most of them agreed on the right of secession. They just felt not now. One important thing is there's no sense in which they had many of them had any sort of friendly, their attitude toward the North was of deep suspicion. Zebulon Vance, who was one of the most committed Unionists, again until mid-April, Congressman and future governor of North Carolina, Thorne and Jefferson Davis's side. He was invited to be he was one of the strongest Unionists there is, but he was invited to be part of the official welcoming delegation for Lincoln. And he says, well, I'm complimented to think that people would think of me as an open-minded enough guy, but that guy's not my friend, and I want no part of welcoming him to Washington. I just think we have enough power we can stop him from screwing us, so I'm not ready to advocate my state leave the Union yet. There's a sort of a belief, we always get caught unprepared for our wars, and we usually do. However, there were some things that took place, little actions that turned out in a lot of cases to have pretty important results. General Winfield Scott clearly was beyond his prime and clearly could not have led the Army through the war. He was in horrible health, old, but his mind was still brilliant. And his work through the secession crisis, getting the country ready was as good as can be done, I think. He wrote a letter in October to President Buchanan saying, there's a lot of forts in the South and we need to think about garrisoning these things because there could be a problem. Secretary of War John Floyd at the time from Virginia, of course, nixed any preparedness measures while he was in. He did a lot of good work shuffling the very limited amount of troops he had, prioritizing key Fort Monroe is the most important site for us. Fort Taylor, Fort Jefferson. They're places we have to defend, places we'd like to defend. Let's get troops into the places we have to defend first. National Capital, Fort Monroe, Fort Jefferson, Fort Taylor. Fort Jefferson and Taylor, Key West, and they control the Gulf of Mexico, basically. He appointed a guy named Charles Stone on January 1st to design the defenses of Washington, find strong points, survey, also weed out the Confederate sympathizers in the local militia and build up a loyal militia. Massachusetts, the new governor, John Andrew, told his militia we need to up the rate of training. That's why it was Massachusetts troops marching through Baltimore on April 19th, because they were ready at the head of the line. Pennsylvania, 5 companies took it on themselves, and we'll hear about them. The most important state by far, New York. They had actually perhaps the only functional militia system. They actually had a state army bigger than the U.S. regulars. The U.S. regulars had 16,000 troops. The roster of the New York militia was 20,000. They were organized in regiments. The ones in New York City were exercised regularly. They were called out for riots constantly. The U.S. Army, 197 companies, all but 18 of them scattered about little posts in the West. 18 companies of soldiers, all artillery in the East. That's basically what Winfield Scott had to play with when I say garrison, moving troops to the key locations, was he had 18 companies, various places that he could move. The first, and of course, what lit the fuse was federal property. There were forts, all the coastal forts, Fort Pulaski, Fort Sumter, barracks, customs houses, most not garrisoned at all. Many of the states seized these forts before they seceded. Only a few sites, 5 sites held out, 5 forts held out beyond the immediate crisis. The ones I keep mentioning, Monroe, Taylor, Jefferson, plus Fort Pickens, also in Florida, in Pensacola, and Fort Sumter. Those were the 5 that held out beyond March 1861. At this point, it was really a nice little dance. We're still polite. The mayor, the governor, whoever would send an emissary to the young captain commanding the garrison of 50 men, demanding their surrender in the name of the citizens of the sovereign nation or state of Louisiana or the whatever. The young garrison commander might write Washington for orders, might not, under protest. This is just the most ridiculous. And I demand the right to salute my flag before I march. That is freely given. The governor might write, tell the young man they're welcome to stay in their quarters until we can arrange transportation. This is all still we want the fort, but you're not a POW. You're a gallant young man who's just on the wrong side, and we want you to be comfortable until you can get passage home. I think I covered that. So, Sumter. South Carolina communicated with Buchanan almost immediately. It's our property, we need it, but long as you don't either reinforce it or resupply it, we're not going to demand you give it to us today. Tomorrow, who knows, but not today. Everybody, obviously, Jefferson Davis has a very long to-do list. He's got a country to form, he's got a Congress to build, he's got an army to build, he's got a diplomatic service, system of finance. Last thing he needs is a war in February. In fact, one of the first acts of national sovereignty, they were so worried in Montgomery about the hotheads in Charleston that the Confederate Congress decided we'll take over responsibility for military affairs in Charleston Harbor. And they sent, I just love saying the name, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard to be the commander in Charleston, which began his love affair with the people of Charleston. December, the garrison is at Fort Moultrie, which is indefensible. Anderson is basically under orders to stay right there. He decides, I can't do that. And he, one night, relocates to Fort Sumter, which is out in the harbor. I should have asked you this before. 100,000 plus pages of official records. Volume 1, Series 1, Page 1, first document in the official records. Anderson's message the next morning to Floyd, saying, by the grace of God, I have relocated my garrison to Fort Sumter. The keepers of the official records said that's when the Civil War started, basically. Floyd blew his stack. He is totally Southern. He's been emptying the arsenals of the North, shipping them south to states that everybody knows are about to secede. He demands that Anderson be ordered back to Moultrie. When Buchanan, for the first time, really shows some spine and says, no, I'm happy with him there. Floyd resigns, dumb move, because we got John Holt. The Southerners who had been giving Buchanan bad advice his whole term left. They were Howell Cobb, Secretary of the Treasury from Georgia, who left almost immediately, was replaced eventually by John Dix, a name you're going to hear a few times. The Interior Secretary, who was serving as a secession commissioner for the state of Mississippi, traveling around to other states telling them why they should secede for a month while he was still United States Secretary of the Interior, finally resigned in mid-January. John Floyd resigned in late December. Not John Holt, Joseph Holt, who was a killer. He had been Postmaster General. He moved up to Secretary of War. He was Lincoln's Judge Advocate General, and among other things, presided over the trial of the Booth, the Lincoln conspirators. This was a strong cabinet, and James Buchanan may well have been the worst president ever, but his last 6 weeks, he was a halfway decent president because he had a cabinet that gave him good advice. Edwin Stanton was also brought in. Lincoln's Secretary of War was brought in for that last 6-week period as Attorney General. So Fort Sumter, Buchanan's happy to, he just wants to get home to Lancaster. He's happy to let this drift. Davis is happy to let it drift. When Lincoln comes in, he's at first happy to let it drift. And then Anderson sends a message saying, boss, we're going to be out of supplies in about a month. What do I do? What should I do? Now, you either have to withdraw or resupply. The cabinet is everywhere on this, but finally decides as our first act, we can't back down. So we have to resupply. The minute the mission is they start fitting out, everybody knows this is a mission to Fort Sumter. The Confederates know day by day exactly to the minute when they're going to sail into the harbor. They are feverishly negotiating with Anderson, trying to get him to surrender. He's going, well, I know I have to in a few days, but my honor just can't. They're almost over the horizon. Finally, Beauregard opens fire. And Anderson holds out for a decent interval and then draws down the flag. I think the clinical term for the reaction is the North went absolutely bonkers about this. The first round of secession, they this one is, they dared fire on the flag. In fact, there are historians who say this is where Americans' thing for the flag comes from. That it was always the national banner. It always flew over like Fort McHenry. Obviously, the song about it. But the idea of revering the flag, of pride in the flag, really, a number of historians say this is where that comes from. Largest gathering ever in Union Square in New York. Even the people who had been excoriating Lincoln the day before about being a warmonger, now this is the ultimate example of rallying around the flag. Lincoln, for the moment, has virtually 100% support in the North. He issues his call for troops. Obviously, that goes to every governor in the United States. That includes the governor of Virginia, the governor of North Carolina, the governor of Arkansas, the governor of Tennessee, etc. They have a quota. Governor Letcher, I need you to supply 4 regiments to suppress the rebellion. If you want a good sharp writing, expository writing, maybe with a little bit of either humor or read the 7 letters those 7 governors wrote. Well, actually, they wrote Secretary Cameron, I think, not Lincoln. They are great reading. They all were outraged, and this is what started the round of secession. The northern response, every northern governor pledged, the governor of Minnesota is in town. And he says, I'll give you the regiment. First Minnesota gets credit as the first regiment because the governor said, I'll give you a regiment. They didn't arrive in Washington until June, though. We got a crisis in Washington right now. There's rumors there's 10,000 Confederate soldiers across the river waiting to come across the river and kidnap the cabinet. I need soldiers yesterday. I don't need soldiers a month from now. Most governors, recruiting was no problem. Everybody oversubscribed the volunteers, but you got to get uniforms, you got to get equipment, minimal training, you have to transport them. Very few people in a position to do that. Who there was, the first regiment to get to Washington, 5 independent companies from Allentown, Reading, Lewistown, and Pottsville, PA, that just as it happened, their captains or colonels had been drilling them. And they were kind of ready, and they had communicated to the governor, or the governor had communicated to them. And on April 15th, when they heard Lincoln had made his speech, they headed for Harrisburg. And they constitute them as a regiment. They swear them in. It's about 600 people. It's a small regiment. And they put on a train and head them for Washington. They're the first people to run the gauntlet in Baltimore. They arrived the day before what's called the so-called Pratt Street riots. They arrived not at President Street Station, at Bolton, because they came in the North Central. So they didn't go down Pratt Street, as far as I know. They had some hassles. They were accompanied by an artillery company that was headed for Fort McHenry, commanded by John C. Pemberton, who was soon to go south and gain infamy at Vicksburg. But he did his duty that day. They guarded, they kind of shushed the crowd away. Next were 4 Massachusetts regiments. The governor of Massachusetts had 4 regiments lined up ready to go. 2 were immediately dispatched to Fort Monroe. The 6th and 8th were sent to Washington. The 6th was the one that arrived on the anniversary of Lexington and Concord, April 19th. After that, it was New York State. New York State, I could do a whole briefing on New York State, which I'm not gonna. They basically were ready with just about a regiment a day. The 7th New York was their immediate tripwire regiment. They were a day behind. They and the 8th Massachusetts were a day behind the 6th Massachusetts. Took them a while to get to Washington. But from there on, it was just a steady stream of New York regiments coming because they were ready to go. By May 1st, 2 weeks after Lincoln's call, you've got that Pennsylvania regiment, you got the 6th and 8th Mass, 2 other Massachusetts regiments went to Fort Monroe, 1st Rhode Island, and 10 regiments from New York already there. Another dozen already formed, but just queued up, ready to board sailing ships or trains to come. By mid-May, they're beginning to create armies about the country. They're not well trained, obviously, but it's a lot easier to equip an 1861 army than a modern army. 2 of the most important people you've never heard of or not heard much about, John Wool, the number 2 general in the army, even older than Scott, 77 years old. He's the commander-in-chief in the East, everything east of the Mississippi River. And John Dix. John Dix is kind of the leading business politician in New York. He's the guy every New York Prince of Wall Street knows and respects. He forms an organization called the Union Defense Committee. John Wool just says, Washington's cut off. There's not even telegraph communication with Washington. Somebody's got to do something to organize this. That's going to be me. And the 2 of them, UDC is formed for a very limited purpose, New York regiments provide financial assistance, help outfit troops, and charter ships to move them to the field of battle. They wind up basically becoming, for a few weeks, but vital weeks, FEMA, the General Staff, Defense Logistics Agency, transportation. I mean, they did the mobilization. Charter ships to transport troops, yeah. But they're chartering ships for blockade duty and for escort duty. They're fitting out warships. They provided rations to Fort Monroe, sent queries to all the northern governors. How many regiments you forming? Where are they? When are they going to be ready? What do you need? Purchased cannon, purchased hospital beds and ambulances, provided arms to, quote, the Union men in places that were, I mean, these guys on their own authority. Lincoln sent $2 million of Treasury money to UDC, which is like $100 million now, basically for them to just spend on their own authority. Unbelievable. Their work was basically done by the end of June. But April through May, this is our mobilization effort. Oh yeah, advising governors, oh, you need to garrison that fort at Portsmouth just to be safe. By June, the regular system, the state adjutant generals, we're not going to fight a civil war with militia. We're going to fight a civil war with volunteer units. That's the state adjutant generals, the regular system. Now we're producing regiments by the score. Everybody is. The 90-day wonders, their term is kind of up. Many of them went home and re-enlisted as volunteer regiments. But we don't need an ad hoc group like the UDC anymore. Wool kind of got caught with a little bit of inter-office jealousy with General Scott. He wound up getting sent to Fort Monroe. But Scott, at the end, as he was leaving, I mean, that's an impressive quote to the UDC. You know, I remember when things were desperate and you were there and you sent the troops forward and saved Washington. Turns out Lee did not want to attack Washington, D.C., but they didn't know that. So, border states. The 7-state Confederate States of America, we would not have had a 4-year Civil War. I mean, Birmingham is 100 miles from the United States of America in that configuration. 14-state Confederate States of America, I think, I mean, 11 states gave the United States all the war they needed. 14 states, it would have been, I think we'd be looking at a different map of North America. Delaware was never in play. Kentucky, barely in play. Very strongly unionist. The governor was pro-secession, but the votes over and over, public elected, overwhelmingly pro-union legislature. Simon Bolivar Buckner was the head of the militia, but the pro-Confederates, there was little they could do except organize companies and go south with them. Lincoln provided arms to the Union men. Kentucky did try its hand at neutrality. When the Confederates moved into the state, Grant jumped in from the other end. Very tellingly, the legislature passed a resolution ordering the Confederate arms out of the state, not ordering both armies out of the state. Virginia, economically, strategically, just symbolically. You know, 7 of Lincoln's 15 predecessors were born in Virginia. The founding fathers heavily were from Virginia. They mattered, their industry mattered, their location mattered. Tennessee, deeply divided, any state with Appalachian Mountains. Virginia was, Tennessee, Kentucky. They were the last of the 11 states to secede. 5 of the 7 governors of those states at least leaned pro-secession. The only two Unionists were Hicks of Maryland, Letcher of Virginia. Some of them, Rector, Ellis, Jackson, really were fire eaters. They were not elected as they were elected in either 1858 or 1860 on the basis of banking policy, railroads, canals, agriculture, political issues, not secession. The militias in Maryland, Stewart and Trimble, both became important figures in the Army in Northern Virginia. Buckner in Kentucky, Frost, and eventually Price in Missouri. A lot of politics going on there. Kentucky was not a southern state, even though it was more of a western state. Their attitude was just not southern. Maryland was a southern state. They really felt more affinity with Virginia than Pennsylvania or New York. Importantly, pro-southern in no way, and Maryland emphasized this over and over, pro-southern in no way means pro-secession. Don't assume they're synonymous terms. Missouri was a funny state because you got Little Dixie, the interior, but St. Louis is more like Pittsburgh. It's a big industrial city, lots of German refugees. North Carolina, I'll quickly run through these. I know I'm taking way too long. Another example of people who are still part of the Union and not ready to secede, but doesn't mean they like or trust Northerners. Some people in North Carolina jumped the gun and seized the Fayetteville Arsenal in January. The governor orders them to return the arsenal. I'm not ready to do this yet. And writes Buchanan apologizing, saying, we're sorry, some hotheads did this, we've returned it to your young captain. However, I need to let you know the reason people were so worried, they think you're going to garrison the fort. Imagine that. The President of the United States sending a garrison of United States troops to a United States facility located in the United States. The nerve of him. How dare he? Well, if you're a state, that much left in the Union, that's your attitude. And that's really where these states were. Beautiful. I mean, this is an era people understood rhetoric and they knew that words could be weapons. This correspondence between Holt and Ellis. Holt, should I receive assurances that no troops will be sent to this state prior to 4th of March, that's Inauguration Day. You can't make commitments for Lincoln, I know that. Then all will be peace and quiet here, and the property of the United States will be protected as heretofore. If, however, I am unable to get such assurances, I will not undertake to answer for the consequences. That's a good, loyal governor talking, isn't it? Holt to Ellis. This guy's a killer. This guy's a stone-cold killer. In answer to, I am directed to say that they, in common with the other forts, arsenals, and public property of the United States, in the charge of the President, and if assailed, no matter from what quarter, under what pretext, it is his duty to protect them by all means. Now, this is, among other things, breaking news, because Buchanan's policy until now has been, you guys aren't allowed to secede, but I have no authority to do anything to stop you from seceding. Now, thanks to Holt, Dix, Stanton, and he's stiff in spine, he said, yeah, you try to take any of my property, you're going to be dealing with my army. Then he sticks, it is not his purpose to garrison the forts, because he considers them entirely safe, as heretofore under the shelter of that law-abiding sentiment for which the people of North Carolina have ever been distinguished. Should they, however, be attacked or menaced, he could not escape from his constitutional obligations. And then, the very satisfactory and patriotic, they must have loved writing this sentence. Very satisfactory and patriotic assurances given by your excellency, which he did no such thing. Remember, he gave him a threat to end his letter. In entertaining the confident expectation that no such contingency will arise. And we'll see you at the OK Corral in a few months. Ellis wrote the best letter. Your dispatch is received, and if genuine, which its extraordinary character leads me to doubt. This letter was so stupid, I can't believe you wrote it. Must be a forgery. But I have to say, subjugating the, blah, blah, blah. Zebulon Vance, I was making a speech about, staying in the Union, and I was gesticulating when the word came of Lincoln's speech, and my arm fell slowly and sadly by the leg of a secessionist. I mean, he told that story in 1888 to a crowd in Boston. There might have been a little bit of, revisionist, like the Barlow Gordon tale of, all of that stuff. Many post-war stories that had a little value added to them. But that's the story he told, and he was sticking to it. To give you the vote in February, they voted whether to have a convention, and it failed. They couldn't even get a majority to say, let's have a convention and talk. May, unanimous. I'm going to skip these because I want to get to Maryland. Probably most of you know most of this. Baltimore, I'm not going to say was a pro-secession city, but strong secession feeling in the city. The state, the West is pro-union, the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland are pretty strongly pro-secession. My own personal opinion is left to their own devices. It would have been a narrow vote not to secede, but if someone else says a narrow vote to secede, that's another respectable opinion. Governor Hicks was pro-union and a pretty effective guy, considering the constraints he's operating in. He did his job. The Baltimore mayor, George Brown, it's really hard to tell. He was at least not horrified at the idea of secession. He was a politician, I think, mostly. George Kane, the police chief, was strongly pro-secession. Also, fortunately for the Pennsylvania guys and the 6th Massachusetts, he was a professional. He understood he had his duty. Like his men, they had total contempt for these invaders who are marching behind them, and the mob is their good old boy buddies. Come on, George, go home. We got to get these guys to the train station. They knew they had a duty to serve and protect, even though they thought these people were the scrapings and vagrants and, basically invaders. There, the bottom is what remains of President Street Station where they arrived. The top is Camden Street Station where they got on trains to Washington. About a mile between them. Most big cities, you could not run trains through the city, so they had a mile of city streets they had to navigate on city streets. On April 19th, 6 days after the fall of Fort Sumter, 4 after Lincoln's speech, the 6th Massachusetts, this was line up and fire volleys. This was war. I think 20 people killed, some number on that order. They did get to the train, they did board the train, they did get to Washington. That night, the politicians communicated with Lincoln and Scott, no more troops through Baltimore. The militia and Kane took more direct action. They went north of Baltimore and burned all the railroad bridges on both the Philadelphia line and the north, cut the telegraph. Washington is cut off from the world. They developed an alternate route by ship to Annapolis, across a junction railroad to Washington Junction, south of Baltimore, catch the train to Washington there. They had to rebuild the railroad. Took several weeks for the next troops to get to Washington. The 7th New York was the next. The 8th Massachusetts was sent to deal with Baltimore. And this is where a well-known name, didn't yet have the nickname Beast, Ben Butler, enters the picture. He was actually a brigade commander of Massachusetts troops, but he was with the 8th Massachusetts. So he became the first of a number of military governors of Baltimore. Again, which side, Mayor Brown wrote the governor. The governor wrote Mayor Brown and said, can we have back our dead boys? The governor says, not possible, we're cut off from the world, but be assured, we're taking very good care of the boys. They're resting in a mausoleum in a cemetery, and we'll see to it you get them back. It's, and they're being treated with dignity and honor. Andrew writes back and says, thank you. I am overwhelmed with surprise that a peaceful march of American citizens over the highway to the defense of our common capital should be deemed aggressive to Baltimoreans. Ben Butler, again, Governor Hicks said, I wish you would not land your northern troops at Annapolis. It's likely to inflame people. Butler says, I need to correct what I hope is just a grammatical mistake. My men are not northern troops. They are a part of the whole militia of the United States obeying the call of the President of the United States. This is a loyal state showing, a firm belief that United States troops coming to the defense of the Capitol are invading our territory by passing through the state. Obviously, that's not going to be allowed. Baltimore will pay the price. Butler declared martial law. He was quickly dispatched to Fort Monroe. He's replaced by Nathaniel Banks, then by John Dix. All of them were harsh. The rule in Baltimore was harsh. I like one of the banks in Baltimore that's Nathaniel Banks, obviously, and Scott saying, Governor Bank, just chain up that dog Baltimore until he behaves himself. These are patriotic envelopes of the time. The mayor and council protested to Congress. Congress wrote Lincoln saying, please explain what you're doing here. Lincoln, it is judged to be incompatible with the public interest at this time to furnish the information called for by the resolution. We used to, when I worked as a defense consultant, those were called thank you for your interest in national defense letters. Ex parte merriment, still cited. It's called it's technically not a Supreme Court case. Justice Taney heard the case, but he heard the case sitting as a circuit judge. But Merriman was one of the bridge builders. There's no present the body, habeas corpus. At the hearing where the body is to be presented, the War Department sent, I think, a lieutenant colonel. Justice Taney says, I don't see Mr. Merriman here. And the guy said, in essence, I don't have any information for this court today. Sort of like Andrew Jackson when the Supreme Court said he can't evict the Seminoles. And Jackson said, well, Mr. Marshall has issued his decision, now let's see him try to enforce it. Lincoln was many things. He was a cold-hearted, practical, very pragmatic politician, to be generous. Maryland remained divided. The martial law was eased considerably. Most of the political prisoners were released. But it was occupied. The first cover, Marylanders know their rights, and knowing their rights, that's to me said by somebody who thinks their rights are being inflicted. Maryland on the fence, and a long way, Star Spangled Banner, that's a pretty pro-union statement. The cover is a play on Maryland, My Maryland. The text is Maryland, My Maryland, a very bitter anti-occupation, the despot's heel is on thy shore. This is the stars and stripes I hope will wave in Maryland, my Maryland, when every traitor's in his grave in Maryland. I mean, it's a play on the poem. Never attained the duration of the fiat justitia. Literally, let justice be done. In the Middle Ages, it's kind of like a notary. I mean, a wedding license, a deed, nothing is legal unless the baron or the king makes his fiat justitia statement. It's a really bitter, I mean, this references Fiat Justitia by a Lady of Baltimore. And this is another poem. It's about the prisoners, the political prisoners. The state legislature, the state police board, the bridge burners, etc. So, quick summary. I'm going to make the case for Lincoln. I mean, for sake of argument. A historian might look at Maryland and say, they weren't going to secede. And besides, you know, one, the crackdown was probably unnecessary, and it was constitutionally, at the very best, questionable. I mean, you're being polite to use that adjective. He was so far out over the edge. How Lincoln looked at it. And again, I'm not saying he's right. I'm saying this is what he saw. First of all, I can afford zero risk Maryland secedes. If Maryland secedes, you know, Lansing, Michigan is now the I mean, we got to move the capital if we can. Everywhere I look, I mean, they tried to kill me on my way to Washington. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but he thought they did. Pressed, you know, I mean, my soldiers had to fight through the state, etc. I don't know they'll remain loyal, and I can't take a chance, so I'm going to cut some corners here. That's how Lincoln saw it. So where we wind up. Now the sides and the battlefields are chosen. The 4 seceding states doubled the white population of the original 7 and added important infrastructure. Importantly shifted the border 100 to 300 miles north and furnished 40% of the Confederate States Army, those 4 states. The 3 states plus Western Virginia denied even more resources. If they had gone out, 2.9 million white population, Port of Baltimore, Port of St. Louis, Chesapeake Bay is a Confederate lake. The borders would have now been the Mason-Dixon line and the Potomac River. Philadelphia is 50 miles from the Confederate States of America. Cincinnati's 1. Where's the capital go? You've got the St. Louis Arsenal. You've got, the North has to worry now about it. I mean, you know, it may be the Central Valley of Pennsylvania that's under threat, not the Shenandoah Valley. You can't step across the river and conquer Northern Virginia. There's no on to Richmond. You've got to fight through a lot of Confederate territory before on to Richmond becomes relevant. Many more resources to defense. Among other things, just one thought, every resource in Maryland, if Maryland goes out, is not just denied to the North, it's a double loss. Most of the officers of those 3 states went south. So it wouldn't have affected the officer corps much, but those 3 states brought something like 200,000 soldiers to the Union Army. There's every reason to believe some of them may have had a thought-out theory of the Union and all. Most of them, you have to think, signed up to fight for the state they lived in. And you have to think many of those would have joined the Confederate Army. And therefore, you've got maybe the most important factor, 200,000 soldiers denied the Union Army, 200,000 soldiers added the Confederate Army, plus all that geography. I mean, the Union Army was out of troops by 1865. You know, they did not arm the colored troops out of a sense of altruism. They armed us out of a sense of desperation. 200,000 more taken away and added to the other side might just by itself have been enough to shift the scales. So these decisions were of great consequence. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And even sell a book if anybody's interested.
First off,
I apologize for this, the spring fever, or not spring, you know, the pollen just hit me like a ton of bricks today. Questions?
Did you hurt your foot marching through Baltimore?
Yeah, pretty much. No, I used to be, until a few years ago, I was the guy everybody said, I can't believe you're that old. And I mean, that really does make you, and now I'm the guy everybody says, sir, can I carry your tray for you? I've learned if anybody offers to help, the answer is yes, thank you. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the border states as such. The western part of Virginia, the illegal state of West Virginia. Do you think that it had much of an effect on the war?
It was,
There were Union sympathizers in eastern Tennessee, but they didn't really.
no,
There were some
there was,
in North Carolina, they didn't really do anything.
now West Virginia, there were organized regiments that joined both armies. 7th West Virginia is one of the really distinguished regiments in the Army of the Potomac. But no, they did not. And the net, I think if you counted them as an eighth of the, you know, the states that have to decide what they may very well have been the most pro-Southern of the 8. That point, illegal, you think, well, if it's legal for a state to secede, it must be legal for counties to. There was actually a strong legal theory that says, no, the states are individual sovereignties. The counties are part of the state. There's no theory that says a county can leave the state. But, you know, in war, the decisions are made.
They should have been ceded as the state of Virginia. Really.
Right. George McClellan made that decision, you know, really his best 2 months of the war. And Robert E. Lee's probably worst 2 months of the war. Yes, sir.
I would argue, actually, though, when you look at the Ohio River side of West Virginia, that the cities on the West Virginia side had much more in common with the fellow cities on the other side.
Oh.
Because that was that was one industrial system.
Yeah,
And I mean, they were going to stay with Ohio.
yeah,
They were looking forward.
there was a series of books written mid-50s maybe, Rivers of America, and one point they make is in the early days, the significant connection wasn't miles of road, or the significant connection was rivers. And if you were 200 miles away from somewhere on the same river, you were neighbors. Where if you were across, you know, if you were in Cumberland, Maryland, you know, you were weeks from Baltimore. But if you could reach a river, you were, you know, in hailing distance of Cincinnati. So yeah, anybody along the Ohio River would have been Ohio River territory. That's one reason Kentucky was really more of a western state than southern state, because you had Louisville and the states along the river. Missouri, I wish, this is the first time I've tried to cover both topics. I usually do one or the other. I think I'll go back to one or the other because there's too much I had to. Missouri was a better story even than Maryland. The skullduggery, the dirty deeds, outright warfare. Franz Siegel, I fight Schmidt Siegel, had his best month of the Civil War out there before the war started. He was the commander of the German militias who were the mainstay of the Union. Frank Blair Jr., famous Maryland family, was the political consigliere in St. Louis. They brought a really aggressive and probably insane young Army captain named Nathaniel Lyon, and he tore Missouri to pieces, but kept it in the Union at probably cost we're still paying for today. But that was a great story too. Yes, sir.
I thought I read once that Jefferson and Berkeley counties would have stayed with Virginia had it not been for John Hopkins threatening to cut the railroad off to Martinsburg.
Oh, that I don't know. I had the privilege of editing an Eric Wittenberg book, but it was on the Meade-Sickles controversy. I actually never read his book on the secession of West Virginia. So I'm not an expert on that at all. Although I did wind up spending a night in Wheeling last summer and got down, I mean, their Independence Hall is still a, local landmark. It's still there.
And Eric will be here next month.
Will he?
Yes.
Ah. What's he on?
The Johnson Gilmore.
Oh. Yeah, he's got quite a library of topics to pick from. I haven't seen Eric for some time. Any other questions?
Again, sir. Go ahead.
Just one thing, at the beginning, you were talking about how the rallying around the flag, pretty much, came from Sumter. This isn't a question, it's just something. In end of February, we were in Charleston, and I don't know if anybody's ever done this, but we took a boat over to Morris Island, which is almost impossible to do if you the tide at the wrong moment. But we were over on Morris Island, and we were trying to find any traverses left over
Mm-hmm.
from the assault on Battery Wagner, and right about noon, they raised the flag at Sumter. They have the reproduction, and they were playing music with it, and it was so incredibly moving. I mean, we were all struck. We didn't think we were going to be moved by it, but when they raised the flag at Sumter again, it was really
Mm-hmm.
it was impressive.
Yeah, one story I've heard enough times, I think it's true. Vicksburg, of course, surrendered the day after Pickett's charge, July 4th, 1863. I've heard many times Vicksburg never celebrated the 4th of July again until 1976, over 100 years, that they just, we're back in the United States, but we just don't have our heart in July 4th.
Again, thank you, Mr. Reed. And again, ladies and gentlemen, our speaker next month will be Eric Wittenberg. I hope you all can join us. And this is going to be our last presentation for the regular season. So keep an eye out on your emails for our summer programming that we're going to be doing, and of course the summer newsletter as well. But everybody have a great rest of the week and rest of the month. We'll see you next month.
I didn't even get a chance. I assumed you were Matt, but we never established that for a fact.
Nope.
You're a World War II person as well?
World War I more than World War II. But I have a
Yeah, I ran into the guy who designs the magazine for American Battlefield Trust.
Oh.
Had a gathering of his photographers at Gettysburg a few months ago, and he invited me to join, and I met a guy there who said he's acquainted with you. I don't remember.
Come on back down and join us next month when Eric's here.
I might do that, actually. Although he's going to ask me what the hell happened to his book. He wrote a book on the Meade Sickles. Oh,